All right, so today is the big day. We're gonna try to fire up this 3.2 liter engine out of my hot rod Mac. This came from a 1989 and I've swapped the fuel injection over to the PMO Induction EFI system. It's running a standalone ECU from Emtron. It's got all the bells and whistles on this engine with the modern sensors and pickups and crank fire, sequential, all the good stuff. If you haven't seen part one, I sort of talked about all the parameters that are used to make this engine run. I also want to get you guys caught up on some of the configuration that's been done since this engine was displayed. This engine was displayed at the Air Water Show in Costa Mesa. Since then, I've adjusted the linkage, I've configured all the sensors, I've double checked the injectors and the wiring and just basically done as much as I can before I fire it up to make sure it's correct. Obviously, we don't want to damage the engine. It does have a lot of fail-safes built into the ECU, but I've checked everything. So let me get you guys caught up and then we'll be back here to start it up. In part one, I mentioned how the fuel injector spray pattern is kind of interrupted by the lower manifold. So I took this apart and made a little modification to the manifold so the injector can spray directly into the intake valve. Ever so slight little moon shapes there. I got them pretty equal. So you might be able to see directly in there and see the injector. Okay, the gaskets and the lower manifolds are all dialed in. I don't know that that's going to make a dramatic increase in power or drivability. I just feel better about doing it. I know that with sequential fuel injection, we have the opportunity to time the injector so it can shoot right into an open valve for the higher RPMs. So I have a feeling it's beneficial. Will it prove out in the dyno? I have no idea, but at least I can sleep better at night. That's 3/4 from closed. 3/4 turn from essentially closed. I had a 1.5 thousandths feeler gauge in there, but I'm going to do both sides the same so I can keep track of the number of turns. Okay, that's 1.5 thousandths right there. And then I'm putting a mark on the 12 o'clock position. So straight up is going to be my reference point. And I've done the same for both sides. And then using a screwdriver, I'm just going to open it up 3/4 of a turn. So that's half. And then the line coming straight at me is 3/4. I've done that same for both sides. That's going to let it idle, hopefully. So the next big thing to do on the synchronization is to connect this throttle linkage. So this is the system that takes this directional pull from the accelerator pedal and distributes that motion to both sides. Now, if both sides aren't moving the same way, bank 1 or bank 2 is going to have more air than the other. So synchronization is very important, and it comes down to the geometry so that when we pull on this one, it's going to push on these evenly. So what I'm seeing already is the bar is a little bit to the left. So you can see the alignment of these two balls. Normally it sits up here, but if I drop it down, I can kind of get an idea how far it's in or out. So this is justified to the left. This one is justified to the left too. In an ideal world, these things would be more on top of each other. So you want the angles to be the same. Right now, if I was to connect this one would be, kind of pointing this way, and this one would also be pointing that way, but it's not symmetrical. So we have a little bit of wiggle room in these brackets. So we're going to try to position it the best we can. And then there's also some jam nuts and things that will allow us to position it left and right. But ultimately, we want to have the same angles on these drop links from left and right. Also in this direction, it's important too. So you can see here, there's a little space between the balls. And these balls on this side are actually touching. So that's not good. Okay, we're getting closer, but we still need to go this way. So I'm going to use this jam nut and see what we can do. Got a real thin wrench. I can push this bar over just like that. So now I'm almost directly in line here. This side is just got a little bit more to go, and ideally we want to shift that side back too. We may have to slot the holes a little bit on that one because this needs to be perfect. Also, it's making contact on this side first. And you don't want this to have play in it like that either. That's not good. I remove this side because I'm going to slot the holes to push it back. I'm also using this angle gauge on the crossbar to make sure it's pretty much level. So it's half a degree out. Looks like this side could come up a little bit. So it's always good to try to, have things parallel and as symmetrical as possible. I think I've made some progress with the brackets. So now I got the crossbar completely horizontal, and the balls are basically stacked on top of each other. And it's about at 11:30 on that one. This one's at about 12:30. So 30 minutes off of the vertical, but it's symmetrical on both sides. The balls are pretty much stacked on top of each other. So alignment there, and that one there is also in alignment. This is where I ended up with on that jam nut. It is pretty far out. And if you notice, this bracket is much thicker than this bracket, and that is by design because this is the one that kind of dictates the position of the rod. This one's not supposed to deflect. This side here acts like a spring. It's much thinner. So when this engine gets warm and the whole thing expands, it's going to get wider. So that spring on the right is to compensate for temperature differences. So when this engine warms up, we'll validate that this rod is not got any play in it. Right now it fits really tight. These are the drop links. There's little turnbuckles on there so we can adjust their length. And I'm just using some assembly lube inside here and on the balls. I'm not sure if there's something better. Let me know what you guys use, but this has some moly in it. I think it's pretty good for this kind of application. So now that they're both connected, what's happened so far is it's already opening up this side and this side's closed. So we just got to adjust that to synchronize them. There should be no tension on the throttle plates when both are connected. So I can tell already this side's too long. So we'll just loosen up these nuts. This one's reverse thread. And then we'll just turn that until that gap goes to 0. See right there. So now when we actuate the throttle, they both go back to their stops. Okay, for this test, I have the linkage. It's got some baling wire, and it's holding the throttle open just a little bit. You can see the throttle blades are open. I don't know how many percent that is, but it's open to where you can see a big gap here, and then there's a gap here. And what I'm doing is I'm using some pin gauges or some punches to just make sure it's the same on both sides. So that one won't go through, and it won't go through on that side either. So I think that's close enough to go ahead and start it up. We'll use the synchrometer and a couple other things to synchronize it a little bit better, but I think we're within the range. So I'm going to go ahead and lock down the nuts. Another thing I wanted to show you guys is this angle meter fits right here on the ball cup there, or right there on that linkage. So I get 80.1 on this side. And on this side, I'm getting 80.25, 80.35. So the angle in this direction is very consistent between the banks. Despite the cylinders being offset and the PMOs being offset, things are adjusted pretty well here. I can visually see that those linkages are almost vertical. They lean in just a tiny bit. So there's that side, practically vertical. This side here looks like it's leaning in just a slight bit. So I think the next thing to do is to set up the throttle position sensor, because it's critical for the airflow strategy that we're using to model the fuel delivery on this engine. It's located back here on bank 2. That is going to measure exactly what percentage opening that the throttle valves are. So we need to calibrate it for full open and full closed. So I've basically connected now to the Emtron. The Emtron unit mounted down here at the moment, but it's connected via Ethernet cable over here to my laptop. And so now we're gonna kind of, not use the toolbox as much. We're gonna kind of use the computer to kind of finish this calibration and hopefully get this thing up and running. So I've got a battery connected. I can switch the Emtron on with the control box there, the Zalix control box. But I have removed all the fuses except for the ECU fuse. I'm just going to start to troubleshoot one sensor and one circuit at a time. So these fuses are for things like the ignition coils, fuel injectors. We're not quite ready to troubleshoot those yet. I think now's a good time to fill you guys in on the ECU and the laptop and that whole connection that goes together. So the dealer that I bought the Emtron or ECU from has included a 911 base map with most of the configuration for the sensors that I have on this engine. So that's a big plus to get started with. There's still configuration to be done, but I'm able to kind of follow a base map. And I'm not going to go through every single menu in the calibration and configuration, because the Emtron is highly configurable. The interface is pretty intuitive, pretty easy to use. I'll give you guys some peeks at some of the things I'm doing. So up here on the upper right, it shows throttle position, and it's on the idle stops right now. It's got a 3.2% reading. And down here is another little throttle position indicator or graph. So when I blip the throttle, you can see that that graph is moving. And you can also see here in the main VE table, I'm operating in different cells from about 3% all the way up to near 100. 100%, that's almost full throttle. I'm just pulling it by hand. Yeah, that's it. So it's got a slight error at idle. Instead of reading 3, it should read 0. So we can go ahead and calibrate that in the software. So if we go to config, engine setup, there's TPS closed calibrate. We'll click that, calibration complete, and we now show the throttle positions at 0 or -0.1. That's pretty accurate there. You can't see it doing anything, but let's just see what that looks like in terms of response. We'll do a couple real slow ones too. Here's the data log here in white showing throttle position, and I blipped the throttle several times between both stops. The next thing to have a look at is the MAP sensor. It's also used in the fuel calculation. So I'm getting the manifold pressure, which is the MAP sensor, of 101.7 kPa, and the barometric pressure is 101.7 kPa. This baro sensor is built into the ECU. It comes calibrated. I'm at sea level, so 101.6 is accurate, and so is the manifold pressure. And then what I've done, this is the sensor itself right here. It's going to get mounted to the car, so it's kind of hanging loose. But I have this hose attached to my vacuum pump, and this is a 0 to 1 bar sensor, so I can put vacuum on it. And as I'm doing that, we can see that the number here is decreasing. My manifold pressure has gone down to 30.6. Next up is the intake air temperature sensor. It's here on the bank 1, and it's an open-ended temperature sensor inside the air cleaner. You know, this fits over. So it's getting filtered air, measuring what is about to go into the engine. This is important for fuel density calculations, air density calculations. So let's go ahead and calibrate this. Right now it's showing on the computer, it's showing an intake inlet air temperature 25.2 degrees C. That seems about right. Right now my temperature outside is about 23 C. And then just to make sure it's wired correctly, I'm just heating it up a little bit, and we're seeing it climb like it should. That's 42, and I'm not hitting it that hard with heat, so yeah, 59, 60. But while we're here, let's hit the cylinder head temperature and see if we can get that to move. And it's connected to the head, so it's going to take a little while, but we're already up to 19 C. That appears to be working as well. The next sensor to check calibration is the fuel pressure sensor. It's gone right here into the regulator. I set this up with a mechanical gauge when I did all the plumbing to be 3 bar. It's about 43.5, I think it is, PSI. So I'm gonna go ahead and I've attached the hoses to the plumbing system, and it's coming from this outboard fuel tank. It's got its own electric fuel pump. So I'm just gonna wire direct to the battery, build some fuel pressure, make sure we don't have any leaks, and then double check the calibration in the computer. Okay, the fuel pump is running, and I'm just moving around, making sure none of these fittings are leaking. And so far, so good. Nothing leaking, so we are good to go check the pressure. And my fuel pressure is this one, 317.5 or 317.3 kPa. That looks right to me. Okay, I just looked it up. 3 bar is 300 kPa, so I'm going to adjust this down. You hear a slight change there, so let me get out of the logging window. Fuel pressure, 299.7, so we're right there. The other thing we can do is put a vacuum on this and see how that changes the pressure. It should create a lower pressure when we pull a vacuum on that. You can hear the fuel pump changing. That would be like full pressure, full manifold pressure, and it just subtracts that reading. So I'm getting, on here, that's like 25 kPa. And then the fuel pressure drops down to 230 kPa. And that's important to keep the fuel pressure even across the fuel injectors. But the reason why you want less fuel pressure at idle is because when the throttle plates are closed, the engine is under high vacuum. And that vacuum tends to suck more fuel out of the fuel injectors. If you were to leave the pressure at 3 bar and then you have a depression of vacuum, the fuel injector really sees something like 3.3 bar. And that's going to create more fuel flow that you don't want at idle. So this allows it to compensate, so the differential pressure across the fuel injector is always the same. It seems counterintuitive that the fuel pressure is always changing, but it's basically a compensation to allow the fuel injector to work as it's designed at 3 bar. So it always sees 3 bar pressure, no matter what the engine vacuum is. That's the goal. Okay, the next sensor to check is this oil pressure combo sensor. This measures oil pressure and oil temperature. It goes in that factory location. That one is not as important for getting the engine to run. It's more of a fail-safe device. The system will monitor oil pressure. If you lose oil pressure, it could shut down the engine if you wanted to. But the other thing to do now, I have removed the spark plugs, and I'm going to build up oil pressure and check the gauge. But at the same time, I'm also going to try to calibrate the crank sensor. The position of the crank is very important relative to cylinder number 1, and we want those two to be in sync. So we need to use a timing light for the original setup. Once it's synced and the offset is known, We can put that in the computer. It'll never have to be done again. So that will allow, I think, power to go to that coil, and we're just going to pulse it as a test. And there it is. It's actually sparking. I'm not going to get too close to it, but hopefully you can see that there's a nice spark there. And this time I've added this extension lead, and that's just going to allow me to, once again, ground the plug. But this time I can attach my timing light here to this lead, and my timing light has a little clamp on it for measuring the current. That's going to allow me to get the timing light to blink each time spark number 1 fires. And then we're going to go here to this mark on the pulley. Right there it actually has Z1. I'm going to lock the timing in the computer to 0. So I'm going to synchronize 0 on the firing of the spark plug to 0 on the crank pulley. Okay, I've dimmed the lights a little bit so I can hopefully see the timing light turn on, but let's crank the engine and see if we can get a mark on this. So it is off by, I'm getting Z1 here and the mark is here. So it's off probably like 20 degrees. So I'm going to go in the software and make that adjustment to try to get those to line up directly on top of each other. But everything is working. Okay, that's closer. Ooh, that's really close. Okay, I've painted a little orange mark on Z1 so I can make sure that orange mark lines up with the notch there on the fan housing. So it's just a few degrees off. Let's try one more time. That's perfect, 658. Also, all that cranking has allowed the oil pressure to come up. This is engine oil pressure, so let's crank it one more time, and I'll show you how that number pops up. That's 260 kPa, which is about 2.5, almost 3 bars of oil pressure. That's typical for a cold engine. So now it's time to put the plugs back in, and we'll test the fuel injectors, and that should be the last thing to check.
Okay, a strange thing, actually a good thing happened. I was trying to configure the O2 sensors. There's an O2 sensor on both left and right banks, and that measures the oxygen content in the exhaust, so it can basically know how the mixture is running in the engine, the combustion, if it's rich or lean. That's what those sensors do. So what I did is I wanted to get a little bit of fuel in the system. I cranked the engine just to get some fuel squirting in there, maybe get a reading on the O2 sensors as I was trying to configure it into the computer. Because the SL6 Emtron basically only has one input for an O2 sensor, it runs on a CAN bus. There's a special module and there's a little bit of configuration to do. But when I cranked it, the engine just started. So I didn't get it on camera, but check this out. It just runs. That's pretty good. So that's pretty good. So I'm super happy that it's running. On the base map is pretty close. So I'm going to be doing some more tuning up. Like once it's reached its operating temperature, I can tell it's running a little lean on one side, rich on the other side, and the idle control still needs a little bit of work. It's not meeting its target RPM. So I'm going to play with it, but I'm going to connect this duct to push the exhaust out because it's probably going to be running for 20, 30 minutes while I, tune some more stuff on it. So I'm just going to use this dryer vent, hopefully get this long enough to my outside, and then we can work maybe a little bit quieter and also a little bit safer without so many fumes, but it's running pretty clean. There we go. So let's see how it sounds with this on. Basically flip this to on. It does have a fuel pump prime, and then just hit start. Okay, so it's running pretty well. I did make some changes to the idle and the timing associated with the idle. Right now, it's mostly using the timing to kind of keep the idle under wraps. I did adjust the throttle blades a little bit. I was at 3/4 of a turn. I'm down now to less than half a turn. It's more like 1/4 of a turn on the throttles, just to get the idle to settle down a little bit. The fuel trims are looking pretty good. So I'll go into more detail in a full tuning video, but the Emtron, basically you set a lambda target or an air-fuel ratio target, and the computer tries to hit that. It's running in what's called closed-looped mode, and it's constantly evaluating what the mixture is in the exhaust, and it's comparing it against a bunch of tables in the software, and it tries to correct it. And right now, the corrections, the short-term fuel trim it's called, is like 6% off. It's actually really close, but the software is able to control it within that range. So the air-fuel ratio right now is running at 14.7 or lambda of 1. That's probably the best fuel economy. I can change it to something a little bit less. It might need to be a little bit less because when I quickly stab it, it does cough a little bit, and that could be due to the enrichment settings, which I haven't even touched yet, or it could be due to the targets. Lambda might be a little too high for the air-cooled engine. But for the most part, it runs. All the sensors are working correctly. I got the O2 sensors connected. I got the MAP. Everything is working correctly. Everything's been calibrated and adjusted. All the wiring is perfect. The signals are all functioning, the inputs, the outputs, the idle control valve, everything is working. I still have more work to do configuring the idle control valve, but you can tell it idles right back down to its target. Right now it's set at, I think, 900. It's coming real close to the target. So yeah, real happy. I'm gonna do, like I said, another video on all the tuning. But this engine can go back in the car now because I can't do much tuning here on the test stand. I can show you on the software sort of where the engine's operating in the tables. And the table's a big 3-dimensional table. I'm only operating in a very narrow band because there's no load on the engine. I can't put a load on it when it's sitting here on the test stand. But once we put it in the car, we'll be able to do all that part throttle tuning, get it much more dialed in for all situations of that table. So please stay tuned for more. This is like part 2 in the series. Part 3 is going to be installing it in the car and incorporating the wire harness. The wire harness is not made for the test stand, it's made for the car. So I'm going to incorporate that and route all the wiring, show you how it ties in with the existing wiring within the car, and getting all the gauges to work and that kind of stuff. And then the 4th video is probably going to be more of the tuning and dyno time and the final horsepower numbers. So thanks again. PMO EFI is awesome. I'm really enjoying this type of work. It's super technical, which is how I am. I love the data, I love the tweaking, and the Emtron is like endless configurations. I'm probably oversimplifying a lot of it. A lot of it, I have spent several hours, like I said, reading through videos and manuals and stuff, and I think I understand most of it. So a huge thank you to PMO Induction. The throttle bodies are working great. Really find that everything was synchronized between barrels. I measured before some of the things with feeler gauges. It's fine. The engine's due for a valve adjustment. I think one of the valves is ticking, so once I adjust the valves, I'll go through and check the synchronization again, but it's fine. We've got the linkage connected correctly now, and all the offsets are great. Any questions, you just leave them in the comments below, and we'll see you guys next week. Cheers.